So, Geri, thanks very much for joining us today. You're the political correspondent for the Yorkshire Post and the producer of Pod Zone Country, which is a brilliant podcast that I recommend everybody to listen to on politics and beyond in Yorkshire. The first question I have for you, Geri, is do you think that the devolved settlements in Yorkshire have had a material impact on politics in the county?
It's a good question, isn't it? Because I think, and we were chatting, just a minute ago and saying that sometimes these devolution deals, these kind of city devolution deals, whether, in Yorkshire, we're talking about South Yorkshire with Dan Jarvis or the new West Yorkshire mayor that we're going to have in May's election, sometimes get a bit lost and diluted when talking about kind of devolution between nations. But yes, I think there definitely has been kind of an impact. And I think if you look at just the kind of COVID stuff, right? If you look over the last year and where the voices have been, if we're talking specifically in Yorkshire, Dan Jarvis has been really at the forefront of that, and I think has made a big difference. But it's not just kind of that impact with the relationship with Whitehall. I think people and voters have come round to the idea that actually having a mayor is a really good thing, and having some devolution is a really good thing, and it means that their voices are heard more locally and they can get things done. So yeah, I do definitely think that there's been an impact there, and it's been a positive change. I think there was some skepticism at first over the roles, but I think that's definitely died down and people are starting to see the value of them.
And there was quite a slow uptake in Yorkshire compared to other parts of England, because for a combined authority to form, you've got to have the agreement of the constituent councils. Obviously, the idea of having that big political figure, as you mentioned, can be controversial in itself because it can take away attention from the council leaders. Michael Heseltine, Lord Heseltine, gave evidence to a committee a couple of weeks ago, and you wrote up a piece about it where he made comment of Yorkshire specifically, where he said, if you were the Mayor of Yorkshire, you could be a world figure. Now, obviously, there isn't a job called the Mayor of Yorkshire. There are, as you mentioned, 2 combined authorities in Yorkshire. Is there a sense that that might change in itself, that there might actually be a bigger role to come as people get a taste for this idea of regional devolution?
So I wondered if we'd speak a bit about this, and there was a campaign called One Yorkshire when this whole devolution thing got off the ground, and really that was to create a mayor for Yorkshire. And to put this into context, in terms of kind of population size, Yorkshire is bigger than Scotland, so yeah, it would be a massive job. The vast majority of the councils were on board with this. They signed it off, but there were 2 that we couldn't kind of get over the line. So in the end, the government wouldn't accept granting this One Yorkshire deal, which would have covered the whole region. So instead, like you say, we've got, South Yorkshire deal is already over the line. West Yorkshire is being elected in May. Consultations underway in North Yorkshire, so they'll be on there soon. And just, was it last week or the week before? I've lost track of my days. The Hull and East Riding was discussed in the Commons, and that's kind of getting underway as well. So I think what we're going to end up having is 4 mayors across Yorkshire, actually. Now, before I kind of get onto that, the One Yorkshire thing was really interesting because there was also some concern that the reason the government didn't want to grant it is because they were pretty sure it was going to be a Labour mayor, right? And yeah, that's probably not a incorrect assumption to make, but I think that you only have to look at places like Tees Valley to see that that's not necessarily how it would go anymore. And I think that really, if you were going to revisit that in the future, the government wouldn't have that case to make. I think the sands have shifted so much electorally, if you look at the 2019 election, et cetera, that you can't say that it would definitely be a Labour mayor anymore. So I think, yes, to answer your question, that could be revisited in the future, but I think we're going to have to get all 4 of the individual city deals in place first, really get them bedded in, and then if the political will is there, move on from there.
Do you think the pandemic has done anything to hasten that? Because what we've seen with figures like, Steve Rotherham and Andy Burnham, is that the leadership and having that sort of strong regional figure has definitely made a difference, and it's embedded itself in people's understanding of what these people do. Because I think prior to the pandemic, people possibly knew there was a mayor, but they weren't necessarily sure of their power. I think we've spoken to a number of people who've said that because of the pandemic, people's understanding has been sort of brought forward, much quicker than it has. Do you feel that might make its own impact?
Yeah, so I've mentioned him quite a few times just in our conversation now, but I had Dan Jarvis on Pod Zone Country really recently, and actually I asked him pretty much the same question: has your profile, has your role been boosted by the pandemic? And he said, yeah. I'm not saying people didn't know about mayors before, but really the role has been given more of a profile due to this. And I think mayors have really kind of been seen to be fighting for their area. And, both mayors you mentioned, Dan, they're all Labour mayors, but actually we've seen it with, Andy Street as well, with Ben Houchin. I think the mayoral positions have quite a unique role in that obviously they are party political, you have party mayors, but it almost transcends that. And I think people have realised that, and realised that actually the mayoral position seems to be more about fighting for the area rather than fighting for a party. And I think that's been quite appreciated, especially in a time like a pandemic where people have, been very concerned about what is happening locally, whether that's tiers or whether that's making sure you can get vaccines or whether that's making sure there's support in place. So yeah, I definitely think the pandemic has boosted that role. And I also think it'll be essential in the recovery from the pandemic, because these jobs are focused on knowing what your area needs. So in South Yorkshire, for example, Dan Jarvis has drawn up a whole raft of plans about what South Yorkshire needs to recover from the pandemic. The mayoral candidates for West Yorkshire, their whole campaigns are basically based on coronavirus recovery. So I really think that how the government hands out the resources for recovery to those mayors will be really interesting to see if they really put their faith in those devolution deals. So yeah, the pandemic's had a massive effect.
It's interesting because I listened to the podcast that you did recently with Dan Jarvis, and he said something really interesting about waiting to be levelled up, talking in the language of the current UK Conservative government.
Yeah, Build Back Better as well. They use that as well.
Better, that's right. And I think that's quite interesting. That point about the partisan element of mayors is sort of pushed aside when it comes to them actually doing their job. Excuse the drilling, apologies. One of the questions I had about that, though, and particularly we're speaking the day after the budget, is what is levelling up? Has it started? Do they feel that this is something that they can actually make a difference in? Because people band the term around, but there's no actual definition of what it means.
You are speaking my language when you ask what is levelling up, because I feel like I spent my whole career asking that exact question. So we've basically moved away from the idea of the Northern powerhouse, George Osborne's baby, and we're into firm levelling up territory. I wrote a piece a few weeks ago on, well, it's basically born out of frustration of every time, excuse me, I'm being handed a cup of tea. Thank you. Born out of frustration of every time levelling up being brought up, it being kind of tagged on to another of society's ills. So I think during the Black Lives Matter protests, for example, the government said that racial inequality would be solved due to levelling up. I think disability rights have also been said they would be solved through levelling up. And there were a few others that were on my list as well. And I think the danger is that it just gets slapped on to every policy as kind of a tick box. Yep, that addresses levelling up. Now, in terms of kind of what levelling up actually is, when I speak to mayors and MPs as well, their view is that it's about making sure, and I'm going to sound like a politician now, but making sure that if you're born in, Bradford, you have the same opportunities as someone who's born in Hampstead or something like that. That's really, I think, what the base of it is. But I do think there's a danger of it being diluted. I do think there's a danger of it being slapped onto every policy. And if you speak to someone like former head of the civil service, Bob Kerslake, who I've spoken to a good few times about this, he shares that fear and says it really still has to be focused on regional inequality. And, you know, that's key for these mayors, closing that disparity gap between the regions of the UK and the North-South divide.
And my final question really, Geri, is Yorkshire, you've got potentially two MPs who will fill these roles after May's elections. So Dan Jarvis currently doing the job in South Yorkshire and Tracy Brabin potentially in West Yorkshire. What do we read into the fact that you've got fairly high profile MPs deciding that they want to vacate Westminster and move to the mayoralties across England? Are they doing that because the job can deliver more than they could on the backbenches, or is it because they see it as a potential platform for potential national roles in Westminster and government?
I think it's a bit of both. I think, you know, we've referenced the podcast I did with Dan Jarvis quite a few times in our conversation, but, you know, Dan says that people say to him that he's the only Labour politician in government. And I think the government, as it stands, probably pays more heed to what he says as a mayor than as a Labour backbencher, right? Albeit a pretty high-profile Labour backbencher as well, you know, was tipped to run for leadership and all that kind of stuff. So I think there are definitely levers available to mayors that aren't available to backbench MPs to improve their areas. But it's a big job, right? So if you take West Yorkshire, Tracy Brabin's constituency of Batley and Spen is just one part of this massive region where there'll be, you know, multi-million pound budgets available for her to control. So it's they're practically bigger jobs. And I think that there is more that can be changed, more that can be improved, more opportunities to take there. It's interesting that you say about the MPs, because I'm a firm believer that actually to do the job, you can't double hat it, which is what Dan Jarvis has been doing for a long time. There is some nuance there in the Sheffield City region deal, South Yorkshire deal, wasn't really kind of a full fat deal until very recently. And Dan's been very clear that he's going to have to take a position when he's up for election next about what he does. Tracy Brabin's already said if she gets the job, she'll stand down. So I think there is a question there, but I do think if the government's commitment to these mayoral jobs and devolution continues in the way it has, these mayoralty jobs are clearly much more powerful than that of a regular backbench MP.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. Well, I'll be watching, and I'm sure many others will be watching to see how it develops. And obviously, May's elections won't be normal in the sense of elections, but you know, they will be fascinating nonetheless. So thank you very much for your time.